Well, you guys really seem to like my arguments for God's existence tier list, so I thought I'd try my hand at making another list, this time about well-known cults. I actually already tend to think about cults as carefully designed tools of manipulation, having set techniques and special abilities and all that stuff, so this really feels like a natural extension of my thoughts on the subject. Hopefully, this list will illustrate how purposely crafted many cult-like structures are. Before we start, though, I have a few points to clarify. First, I don't call or consider any entire religions cults. Most religions contain such a huge variety of adherents and practice within them that if they were considered cults, nearly any social group of humans could be called a cult too. If you want to know exactly what I consider to be a cult, which isn't necessary to understand this video, I've linked previous videos of mine in the card box to explain. Second, I'm not suggesting that any of the groups I mention here are totally homogenous. There is variety in every group. Some members act more cult-like, some members act less cult-like. I'm speaking of general trends within cults here. Finally, and unfortunately, I'll only be speaking on cults which are either Western or Abrahamic, as that's where my knowledge lies. I just don't know enough about Eastern religious sects to speak about them as specifically as I'd like to do here. Maybe if you guys point out some groups like that in the comments, then I'll be able to make another tier list later on. Here, each cult will be ranked according to its stats in 4 areas. 1. Population, the number of members within the group. This has an imperfect positive correlation to the number of people a cult can mobilize for its own gain. 2. Money, the level of usable wealth at the group's disposal. 3. Entrapment, the group's effort and ability to keep its members from leaving. And 4. Political power, the level of influence a group has over the political climate surrounding it. I'll cover 6 cults here, 1 for each tier, with F tier being the least powerful and S tier being the most. Starting in F tier, we have the Amish. If you don't already know, the Amish are homesteading Christian traditionalists originally from Germany who are mostly settled in Pennsylvania, New York State, and the American Midwest. In order to maintain their Christian purity, they live apart from the rest of the world, often speaking primarily German. They also refrain from using nearly any technology which was invented after the mid-1800s. The Amish consider simplicity of lifestyle and plainness of character to be virtuous. To them, the outside world is a corrupting, sinful place in which no Christian should live. Because of this, they school their children in one-room schools, teaching them up to 8th grade. They assign all their members vocations within the community, and either strongly discourage or entirely disallow outside careers or education. Those who break some of their many rules may be outcast from the community unless they repent and change their ways. This is the well-known practice of shunning. Their stats aren't great, but they have been sufficient enough to see the Amish's population grow dramatically even in recent years. They're an estimated 342,000, which isn't bad considering they only produce new members by members reproducing. Their money is very low as they purposely avoid decadence and only work jobs which allow them to healthily subsist off of their own land. There's no central leadership that gets rich off of their followers either. Their strength is their entrapment stat. Members are only taught how to live within the Amish community, they're taught that the outside world is evil, and they threaten their members with shunning if they misbehave. Since they live so differently from the outside world, it's pretty easy for members to identify the disobedient among them and correct them before it's too late. This group has the special ability Anonymize. Most Amish people never receive a birth certificate or social security number, ensuring that any who leave will find it nearly impossible to find work or housing. So, unsurprisingly, nearly 90% of Amish teenagers decide to become baptized into the church before adulthood. Lastly, their political power is low, as they tend to engage solely in their own communities and don't seek to expand their group at the expense of others. Given their fairly small population and almost non-existent money and political power stats, the Amish go in F tier. In D tier, we have a group that a lot of people seem to consider one of the worst or most powerful in the world, Scientology. It's definitely dangerous and frightening, but it really doesn't deserve a higher spot than this, as I hope to demonstrate. See, when a lot of people think of a dangerous or powerful cult, they think the Branch Davidians, Jonestown, Heaven's Gate, or Scientology because they're threatening, unusual, extremely intense in their devotion to a single leader, and they're just creepy. That's not what the most powerful cults actually look like, though, as I hope to demonstrate with this list. I'm sure anyone watching this probably already knows that science fiction writer L. Ron Hubbard founded Scientology in the US in the 1950s. I could spend the rest of the video talking about their weird, intricate, kind of too odd for Star Wars kind of beliefs, but instead I'm just going to limit it to what's relevant to the list. Scientologists are extremely secretive about their beliefs, and what's publicly known about their theology is only out there thanks to ex-members leaking that information to expose the organization. Basically, Scientology says it wants to see every human on Earth go clear, a state where one is free of influence from any conscious or unconscious stressors or traumas. In order to reach this state, a person must gradually advance within the ranks of Scientology, completing training at various advancing levels, and paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to do so. Some members who want to advance but don't have a huge amount of money live on church ships and compounds in order to trade their labor for training. Those compounds often restrict access to non-church sources of information, such as the internet, and restrict members' time spent outside the compound. Their stats are a bit unbalanced. Scientology only has about 35,000 members according to actual census data, not the church itself, making them by far the smallest group on this list. For their size, they do all right monetarily. They own hundreds of millions of dollars worth of commercial and residential properties in mostly Clearwater, Florida, and Los Angeles, California. They obviously make money from members paying to level up in the church, but that's also somewhat of a weakness. There's such a high barrier to entry into devoted circles that not a lot of people can afford to stick around long enough to get really involved in Scientology. Their entrapment stat is strong, though, as the church actually encourages its members to not only disown apostates, but to act hostile toward them. They're enemies of the church, and they should be treated like it according to the policy of fair game. Supplementing this policy is the special ability blackmail. See, to join the church, members must be audited. This process entails admitting one's biggest problems, fears, regrets, and traumas to a member of the church, all while being recorded. So if that new member ever decides to leave, they can be blackmailed back into the fold with the secrets they've revealed. The church has some political influence given its wealth and its influence on some celebrities, but it's fairly small compared to some of the cults higher up on this list. Scientology just isn't quite influential enough to sway large elections. Possibly their most impressive political action is retaining their tax-exempt status. With its decent entrapment but otherwise underwhelming stats, Scientology ranks no higher than D tier. Next up, in C tier, we have the Haredim, a collection of groups of ultra-Orthodox Jews with its largest group in Israel and many others in North America and Western Europe. They're not a homogeneous group theologically, but such a large number live under extremely restrictive rules that I think calling it a cult is justified. I actually visited an ultra-Orthodox city in Israel and was able to see the way they live myself. Perhaps their most consistent trait is their isolationism. Like the Amish, they purposely live separate from the rest of the world and often don't own TVs, computers, or smartphones. They usually believe in very strict gender roles for men and women, including specific items of modest traditional clothing each gender must wear. Of course, they attend Jewish schools as children, where they tend not to learn about unscriptural concepts like homosexuality or evolution by natural selection. Many sects encourage the men to study the religion's many texts full-time, while women are expected to earn all of the family's income and be the primary caretaker of their children. If you want to learn more about the group, there's an entire documentary-style 2-part video about it on my channel for you to watch, which I've already been showing here. Their population is sizable at 1.5 to 1.8 million worldwide, and it's growing rapidly due to their very high birth rates. They make up at least 12% of Israel's population, making them a force to be reckoned with there. However, those numbers don't lend much to their overall wealth, as most ultra-Orthodox Jews live simply, don't often have more than one income per household, and don't seek education levels or careers that bring very much wealth. Their entrapment is decent, as they keep a sharp eye out for backsliders and socially disassociate with, if not shun, those who disobey. Instead of directly confronting backsliders, many in these communities socially punish them until they repent and conform, as my friend Amir explains in the video I mentioned.
No one says to women like, oh, it's probably more appropriate for you not to drive. It's not like Saudi Arabia.
But there's no rule
my mom drove, so I wasn't accepted into schools in this city. No one said to me, oh, you weren't accepted to the school because your mom drives. But I knew, and everyone else knew, that that's why I wasn't accepted.
I mean, I'm in complete culture shock right now.
Finally, their political influence is significant in some places such as Israel, where their numbers are greatest. There, they're actually large enough to affect public policy. For instance, candidates in Israel know that to get the ultra-Orthodox vote, you have to support their religious exemption from military service. So, both many liberal and conservative candidates have stood for and protected those exemptions for decades. This group's special ability boosts its political power, and it's called concentrated living. This group often settles in large numbers in fewer places rather than being spread out. This grants them greater political influence over the regions in which they live, as they constitute a large percentage of the population. With its decent population, entrapment, and a special ability boosting its political power, but little money, ultra-Orthodox Judaism makes it to C tier. Moving on to B tier, where the groups we're talking about start to get pretty huge. Here we have Jehovah's Witnesses. The group began in the US in the late 1800s and eventually became centered around its founder's publication company called Zion's Watchtower Tract Society. Now we just call it the Watchtower Society. Early on, they began distancing themselves from other Christian sects and making end-of-the-world predictions. When their first turned out to be wrong and the date passed, they tried again and again and again until they eventually just started resorting to saying, "Oh, it'll be any day now, trust us." The witnesses believe that they're living in the last days and that as children of Jehovah, they should be separate from the world as much as possible. They don't celebrate holidays, they're not allowed higher education, they don't participate in any political activity, and they don't engage in military service. They also discourage their members from getting any information about theology or their organization from anywhere but the Watchtower Society itself. Everything you need to know is on jw.org is kind of the unofficial mantra for witnesses answering questions about the organization. JWs are fairly quick to disfellowship members who disobey, so their reported numbers are probably not too bloated. Their population is impressive, with about 8.5 million active members all over the world. Their money is significant as well, although there are some modifying factors to understand there. Presently, they're not doing as well monetarily as in the past because they've had to pay out huge sums in lawsuits involving sexual abuse within the organization. However, they are excellent at turning their population into a workforce to make up for some money issues. For instance, their members have proven to be able to construct new buildings for their own use in just a few days without any pay. Their entrapment stat is high, but their strategy on that front is a double-edged sword. All members know exactly what calls for disfellowshipping, watch closely for it, and quickly punish any who cross that line. This incentivizes strict loyalty, but it also sheds members who do cross that line but could have still come back to the fold. They also instill a certain personality in their members. It's the Christian personality, as I've heard it called. That's another way to control their members' thoughts and behaviors to keep them in. Finally, their political power is their biggest weakness, as political activity is entirely disallowed within the organization. With 3 decent to strong stats but 1 huge weakness, Jehovah's Witnesses land in B tier. Alright, on to the big ones. In A tier, we have the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka Mormonism. Just in case you don't have every song in the Book of Mormon musical soundtrack memorized like I do, they believe that the Bible is actually a trilogy and the Book of Mormon is Return of the Jedi. In Palmyra, New York, 1823, Joseph Smith supposedly found golden plates with a new message from God inscribed on them. He could only read them with a seer stone that he sold when he used to be a convicted con man, though. It's confusing. So, yeah, that was the Bible's part 3, the Book of Mormon. Don't get me wrong, Mormons are subjected to a lot of legalistic rules, but they don't seem as quick to punish their members for mild backsliding as the other groups on this list. They restrict the use of all intoxicants, including caffeine. They have strict gender roles. Many of them have to wear sacred underwear, and they, like Jehovah's Witnesses, tend to instill a very specific, overly happy and polite personality. While it's technically optional, it's a serious rite of passage for Mormon men to take a 2-year mission, usually from the ages of 19 to 21, where they literally do nothing but study scripture and evangelize for the church. They can't even speak to their families on these trips. One of the biggest factors that makes Mormonism insular and cult-like is just how tightly most of them stick together and how similar to each other the members are expected to be. Their population stat is huge, with an estimated 15 to 16 million members worldwide. Their greatest strength is their insane level of wealth. The LDS Church is valued at over $67 billion. See, the LDS Church does what Jehovah's Witnesses failed to do. They teach their members to take dominion over the earth, not expect it to disappear. They encourage successful careers so high-profile Mormons can set an example for the world, and they allow higher education for everyone, even owning their own university. This way, their members are able to earn the church several $billion per year in tithes and offerings alone. On top of that comes their special ability, going for profit. The church owns numerous large, extremely successful businesses which bring in more capital. The church is then able to use that capital to invest in new businesses and enormous properties. They pay taxes on that income, but it's still church income, which greatly boosts their religious objectives. Their entrapment is moderate to low. Excommunication does happen, but it isn't as readily used as in other groups we've discussed so far. You're probably much more likely to be guilted and shamed for disobedience than excommunicated. Their political power is high. They're a majority in, and thus essentially entirely control, a U.S. state, Utah. They've also had some well-known political candidates and commentators. Finally, due to the Electoral College and the fact that they live in more rural places in the US, Mormons have probably greater individual voting power than Californians. With very solid population, money, and political power stats augmented by an effective special ability, Mormonism gets to A tier. Okay, here's where I think a lot of my viewers expect me to say the Catholic Church, but I'm not. In S tier, we definitely have Salafi Islam. This is not an organization, but an ideological movement within Sunni Islam encapsulating multiple groups. Salafis are Quranic literalists who advocate for a return to what they consider to be a pure form of Islam, completely unaffected by modern values. This means strict daily rituals, fasting, diet, gender roles, money management, and more. Every day is focused on living how Muhammad and his companions lived in the early days of his teachings. The movement began in Egypt in the late 1800s, spreading mostly across the Arabian Peninsula. It's seen as a response to the Western imperialism as the time, as Salafis make a point to emphasize the importance of living free of corrupting Western influence. A large group of Salafis are political quietists, those who don't get deeply involved in politics for the sake of spreading Islam, although they do strongly support the complete implementation of Islamic law over all people. Another sizable group of Salafis are Islamists, those who act politically in order to establish Islamic law and government. A relatively small group of Salafis are jihadists, who will spread Islam by any means necessary. Their population stat is just absurdly high, with an estimated 80 million members. Of course, with a population that big, there's bound to be less homogeny within the group, but even assuming a fourth of that estimate's members are active, we're still talking about 20 million people. Their wealth is considerable, given that the Saudi Arabian government supports the movement both within its borders and around the world. There isn't exactly a central leader who collects money from and leads Salafis, unless you blur all lines between the movement itself and the Saudi government. Salafis tend to advocate for capital punishment for apostasy. This sect completely dominates Saudi Arabia, which is known for its incredibly harsh treatment of apostates and blasphemers. While it doesn't entirely stop apostasy, it forces many who have left the faith to keep their beliefs a secret or die. Since many Salafis live in places where apostates can legally be treated so harshly, this special ability is often pretty effective. Its political power is ridiculously high, as Salafis have successfully implemented their own laws within a few countries and basically control Saudi Arabia. Without controlling one of the world's biggest superpowers like the US or China, a cult's political influence just can't get much greater than that. So with every stat maxed out, Salafi Islam earns its spot in S tier. Now, I already know a lot of my viewers think all of these groups are OP and should be nerfed, but remember that we're still talking about people here. A lot of these groups do behave terribly when it comes to human rights, but that's not an excuse for us to treat those within them as any less human. Even in special cases such as this, please remember to afford all people dignity and all ideas scrutiny. Thanks for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. As always, go ahead and subscribe, check out my Patreon, follow me on Twitter and Facebook at GM Skeptic, join my Discord, and until next time, stay skeptical.